Hey everybody, welcome to One Human History. Today we're going to talk about a man who served one term as United States president, lost his bid for re-election, and then came back to win a second four-year term. Until a few days ago, he was the only president in history to serve two non-consecutive terms. I'm talking, of course, of Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland spanked me on two non-consecutive occasions.
Since Donald Trump's recent re-election to the presidency, I've been getting a lot of requests to make a video about Grover Cleveland, so I figured, screw it, let's do it right now. So in this video, we'll look at Grover Cleveland's participation in three presidential elections, and we'll see what, if any, similarities we can find between the political careers of Grover Cleveland and Donald Trump. So this is the non-consecutive executive. Guess who's back? Back again. Cleveland's back. No more Ben. Before we get into the material, I would just like to humbly request a like under this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please subscribe. I'm going to be trying to make more videos now that things are heating up in the political landscape, and I appear to have a little bit more time to make these videos, so I would appreciate any help and support you can give me. Thank you so much, and let's get into it. So I'd like to start this video with a quote from the intro to a recent interview with Grover Cleveland biographer Troy Senik. "A former president is ready for a comeback. Despite being a political novice and facing a sex scandal that nearly ended his campaign, he took down a titan of the political establishment in a first bid for the White House, squeezing into office by the slimmest of margins. After 4 years of disrupting business as usual in Washington, he was denied re-election in a close race that some of his supporters claimed was stolen from him. And now he looks poised for a third presidential run at a historic restoration to office. The year is 1892, and the former president in question is not Donald Trump or anyone even remotely like him. It's Grover Cleveland." I think this quote is a great place to start because it shows us how often these one-to-one comparisons fail in helping us understand historical precedent. I mean, for example, I could say he was a political outsider who no one said had a chance to be president. Most people laughed when he announced. He won in a close election, presiding over an era of political and international turmoil, and lost his bid for re-election 4 years later. Am I talking about Donald Trump or Jimmy Carter? Could be either. So just because there are surface level similarities between presidents doesn't mean one situation is directly analogous to the other. And what I understood from reading Troy Senik's book, Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland, is that Cleveland and Trump did have similar careers in some ways, but in other ways their stories couldn't have been more different. Let's start with an area in which I feel Trump and Cleveland are most similar, that being both men's improbable rise to the presidency. Grover Cleveland was a bachelor, a lawyer, and a former county sheriff in his 50s. Although he was well known among elite society in the city of Buffalo, New York, he was a nobody in politics. He had held no national office. He had few connections with the New York political machine, especially the infamous Tammany Hall. But Cleveland's unexpected election to the nation's highest office was largely influenced by the electoral conditions in the country at the time, which made it possible for him to become the candidate and ultimately win. So let's get into that. Now, the first thing you need to understand about Grover Cleveland is that he was a Democratic Party politician in the second half of the 19th century. And the country had not elected a Democratic Party president in almost 30 years. The winner of all 6 elections since 1860 had been a Republican. Abraham Lincoln in 1860, Abraham Lincoln again in 1864, Ulysses Grant twice in 1868 and 1872, Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, and James Garfield in 1880. Additionally, every single one of these guys, except Lincoln, was a high-ranking officer in the Union Army during the Civil War. And I guess you could say Lincoln was the commander-in-chief of that army, so he too was a high-ranking member. What started with Lincoln ended up becoming a true example of a presidential dynasty. And this meant two things for the Democratic Party. Number one, the northern states, which had far more electoral votes than any other section of the country, constituted a red wall that was going to be really hard to crack. So that was one disadvantage they had. But they also had an advantage, because any discontent that the American people felt with the establishment would automatically hurt the Republicans and help the Democrats, because the Republicans were the establishment party. So all they needed to do was figure out a candidate who would be capable of cracking the red wall. That said, the Republican dynasty had yet another significant weak point in its multiple decade-long grip on power. It had almost no appeal in the southern states. In the past, this weakness was not really much of a weakness for the Republicans. In some ways, it proved to be a strength. For example, during the 1860 election, Lincoln wins only the North, but those states have bigger populations and therefore more votes in the Electoral College. During that election, there were 4 candidates, so 3 additional candidates to Lincoln. The Democrats nominated 2 candidates who split the Democratic vote, and there was also a 4th candidate from the National Union Party who picked off some of the states in between North and South. This gave Abraham Lincoln a comfortable victory in the Electoral College without a single Southern state. In fact, he wasn't even on the ballot in many of those states. In 1864, almost none of the Southern states, which were in rebellion, participated in the election, and Lincoln won in a landslide. At the end of the war, the states which had rebelled fell under Northern occupation, and many Southern whites were prevented from voting. They were disenfranchised for participating in a rebellion against the country. Republicans during this time in those states worked to enfranchise black voters, including many former slaves who were reliable Republican votes. And so you can see the beginning of this racial tension between the two parties and how voting reform and enfranchisement of new voters intersects with the race question in America, even in these early days after the Civil War. Thanks to the black vote in the South and the red wall in the North, Ulysses Grant won election twice, 1868 and 1872. But by 1876, people were starting to get tired of constantly electing Republicans to the presidency. For one thing, the Civil War issue, which was Republicans' main talking point, we're the ones who won the Civil War, we did not rebel, so you should elect us, that talking point started to get old. In fact, people started to call it waving the bloody shirt. It's almost like how talking about 9/11 started to lose its rhetorical power in 2012 and 2016. In fact, Rudy Giuliani's run for president was destroyed in 2008 by the fact that he talked about 9/11 too much. He was waving the bloody shirt, and this was causing resentment.
Rudy Giuliani, there's only 3 things he mentioned in a sentence, a noun and a verb and 9/11. I mean, there's nothing else.
Additionally, many of those white Southern voters who were disenfranchised in previous elections were now back on the voter rolls. And with the rise of groups like the KKK, there was a great deal of voter suppression against the black voters of the South, which meant that the Southern states were gradually starting to vote Democratic again and constitute a blue wall in the South. 1876 was an incredibly close election. There was not a clear winner, and so the House of Representatives had to decide who would be the president. The country doubted the results for the entire 4 years of Rutherford B. Hayes's Republican administration, and Rutherford B. Hayes, in order to become president, was forced to agree to pull Northern troops out of the South. And so this was the end of Republicans winning any Southern states for a long time. In 1880, James A. Garfield got just over 1,000 more votes than his opponent, another Civil War veteran named Winfield Scott Hancock, and he did not win a single Southern state. Although the country very much liked James Garfield, he was a young, exciting, vigorous president. He was unfortunately cut down within 9 months of his presidency. And his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, who became the 21st president, in the minds of many Americans was associated with the corruption machine that Garfield had actually been elected to fight against. And although I think Chester Arthur was actually quite a capable president, he was not able to inspire a movement on his behalf, and he did not get nominated for re-election in 1844. So by the time of the 1884 election, the Red Wall was really poised to be cracked. And considering that the Democratic Party could rely on the South to vote for their candidate, all the Democratic Party candidate had to do was crack at least one state in the North, and he'd be the president of the United States. And what happened next had some similarities to the 2016 election. For starters, the Republicans chose a bad candidate. James G. Blaine of Maine. He was a lifelong Republican insider. He was the Secretary of State under James A. Garfield. In many voters' minds, he represented everything they hated about the Republican Party. The spoil system, the corruption of the Ulysses Grant administration. In fact, in much the same manner as the so-called Bernie Bros refused to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016, reform-minded Republicans known as mugwumps protested the nomination of Blaine and refused to support him. At the same time, the Democrats that election chose a great candidate. In a time when voters were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the establishment, the Democrats chose a complete unknown, a Washington outsider with a reputation for honesty and rooting out corruption. Grover Cleveland was a lawyer, a former county sheriff in Buffalo, New York. In 1882, the Democrats convinced him to run an insurgent anti-corruption long-shot campaign for governor, which he miraculously won. Overnight, he became a superstar and an example of an outsider who outperforms expectations. His popularity in that state, along with the perception that Cleveland was against the elites, even within his own party, meant he had an appeal on both sides of the aisle. If Cleveland could pick off New York State, it would swing 35 electoral votes to the Democrats. That was the most electoral votes a state had at that time. And interestingly, just like Donald Trump, who ran in 2016 as a citizen of New York, he picked a vice president from Indiana, in this case, Thomas Hendricks. Both Cleveland and Hendricks delivered their states, along with Connecticut and New Jersey, cracking the Red Wall and making Cleveland the 22nd president of the United States. Once in the White House, the new president set about to repeat his success in New York, trimming the size of government, and bucking the Republican establishment by issuing substantially more vetoes than any other president in the history of the country. Basically being a rogue mover and shaker, a disciplinary figure for the government, a harsh but fair president. This was the perception of him. And although many people saw him as a bull in a china shop, they still respected him as a one-man wrecking ball against the establishment. Cleveland tackled a range of issues, including one which divided his own party, the issue of the gold standard. At that time in the United States, there was a lot of paper money floating around. It was a kind of new thing, and it was backed by gold. So it was sort of a promise. A note was a promise backed by gold. But this meant, as more and more bills were printed, that the economy was running on debt. Now, the advantage to this is you have a lot of liquidity, which encourages economic growth, opening new farms, new industries, moving faster. But the disadvantage is that the gold supply is not always going to keep up with the paper supply. Paper is much cheaper than gold. And this was especially hurtful to farmers who most of all relied on paper money and debt to run their farms. So with the gold supplies not keeping up with the paper, some of these farmers were poised to default on their debt in the event of an economic crisis. Now, to address this, there arose a group of politicians who claimed to be supporting the farmers' interests, and they agitated for allowing paper money to be backed not just by gold, but by silver as well. Silver being a much lighter, a less valuable metal. The idea being to back the currency with metal, but introduce silver so that there could be a little more room to maneuver, a little more liquidity. Things could still move faster, but you wouldn't have the rigid gold standard to rely on. The movement for so-called bimetallism came to be known later as populism. So this is the origin of that word. And it was a very popular idea in Grover Cleveland's Democratic Party, an idea with which Grover Cleveland himself vehemently disagreed. He was a hardliner for the gold standard, so he was in the minority on this issue. Although this position placed him at odds with members of his own party and with farmers, he supported a different policy which helped him in both of those constituencies. This issue, more than any other, came to define Grover Cleveland's first campaign for re-election in 1888.
Tariff. It's more beautiful than love.
Cleveland was hardcore for lowering tariffs, and it wasn't an issue he felt passionately about his whole life. In fact, when he came to the presidency, he knew next to nothing about tariffs. But he put his nose to the grindstone, studied the issue like it was his PhD dissertation, and came down strongly on the side that tariffs needed to be lowered. This was not going to be an easy task for him because the American government primarily relied on tariffs for its revenue. After the Civil War, the United States really kicked into gear in terms of industrialization, and it was at the same time expanding its trade, and the global economy was growing. And so you have these two opposing forces of, do we protect our industry or do we lower tariffs on foreign imports to try to make goods cheaper for people? Is it better to protect American-made goods, or is it better to make goods as cheap as possible by allowing the whole global market to participate? This was the issue then. It's the issue that we're dealing with today, I would say, as well. And Cleveland, unlike Donald Trump, believed that you needed to lower those tariffs. The Republican Party love affair with tariffs actually goes all the way back to Abraham Lincoln, who was a nationalist and a true believer in American industry. He wanted to protect it, and the presidents who followed him, they followed suit. They wanted to protect American industry and industrial capacity as much as they could from competing with foreign industries. However, at this time, those foreign industries weren't at a level where they could actually compete that much. The global trade networks had not been established as they would be later during Woodrow Wilson and FDR, World War II, post-World War II. People were still pretty far away from each other, and the United States was pretty isolated. So Cleveland believed that this might be a good time to try and lower the tariffs. He also believed that the tariffs enriched wealthy people in America, that it fostered inefficiency, and it raised prices for the average consumer. During his presidency, he attempted to lower the tariff, and he failed miserably. And this failure was one of the last things he did before the 1888 election. So he was coming into the election having failed his signature piece of legislation. Other issues complicated his campaign for re-election. Cleveland had not served in the military during the Civil War, and among his many vetoes included one that denied pensions to Civil War veterans. It's hard to imagine this today, but veterans' pensions was one of the major issues in the country at the time. I mean, it was like in the top 10. And it remained so for many, many, many decades. I mean, even Herbert Hoover's presidency was tanked over a controversy involving veterans' benefits. He refused to pay bonuses to World War I veterans. Those veterans showed up in Washington, D.C. and camped out on Capitol Hill. And eventually Hoover sent the military to disperse them. And many veterans who fought and died for the United States were murdered on Capitol Hill. And that was pretty much the end of it for Hoover. So this issue of veterans' benefits really matters in the United States, and especially at this time when many veterans of the Civil War were still alive and still extremely influential in the United States government, in business, in other areas of the country. So for Cleveland to deny veterans' benefits, this provided a spectacular issue for the Republicans to run against him on in 1888, and they sure did. In fact, this was all made worse by the decision on the Republican Party's behalf to nominate Civil War General Benjamin Harrison for president, who was the grandson of the 9th president, William Henry Harrison, and a great-grandson of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So you're not going to beat them on the patriotism front there. This race was still going to be close, but Benjamin Harrison had one last ace up his sleeve. In the last election, Cleveland broke the red wall by taking 2 key swing states, Indiana and New York. Now, Harrison's grandfather, William Henry Harrison, was basically the founder of Indiana, and Harrison was representing Indiana on the presidential ticket. Additionally, he chose a vice president from New York, one with incredibly deep pockets to help fund his campaign. The guy's name was Levi P. Morton. Harrison was active on the campaign trail. He gave a whopping 90 speeches. Can you imagine? Okay, so they didn't campaign back then like they used to, but that was still considered a lot in those days. Cleveland also made a huge mistake in the 1888 election in his choice for vice president. Since Thomas Hendricks unfortunately died during his first term, Cleveland chose Allen Granberry Thurman to be his running mate in the 1888 election. By all accounts, he should have been called Allen Grandpa Thurman because he was 74 years old, which was a lot older back in those days. He was a sickly, weak man who did not offer Cleveland very much. He represented Ohio. Rumors quickly grew that Cleveland's choice for vice president was most likely going to experience the same type of vice presidential term as his predecessor, who died in office. So to calm these fears, they held a rally at, of all places, Madison Square Garden. And they brought out Allen Thurman to give a speech to shut down the critics that he was too old. And during the speech, he had a coughing fit, had to stop early, apologized for feeling ill, and then the newspapers were told that he had the flu. So he did not silence the critics who were worried about him being too old there. All of these factors taken together, the election was close, but Cleveland, although he did win the popular vote, was unable to recreate his victory in 1884, and he was sent home packing. Now, although some Americans believed that the vote count was conducted fraudulently and believed that Grover Cleveland was rightly the winner of that election, Cleveland himself did not believe that. He was actually quite relieved to be unelected president. He was growing very tired of the job. He was looking forward to going back home and living life in retirement. So he and his wife, Frances Cleveland, packed their bags and went back to New York. However, before they left, Mrs. Cleveland said to the White House staff that they would be back promptly in 4 years' time. It seemed that Mrs. Cleveland had more of an eye for returning her husband to the White House than Grover did. But as we will see in the following 4 years, the interregnum period when Cleveland wasn't president, things happened which led to his renomination for president. So let's get into that part now. During his 4 years out of office, Grover Cleveland pretty much completely retired from politics. He was a ghost on the New York political scene. He just wanted to enjoy life with his wife, Frances. He had married her. She was much younger than him, and he had married her when he was president. And so now that he wasn't so busy, they could set about having some kids. So they had some kids. They bought a nice house in Cape May on the Jersey Shore. And Cleveland spent his time working as a lawyer and traveling the ex-president speaker's circuit. So he's giving a lot of speeches and he's practicing law. In fact, he even argues a few cases before the Supreme Court of the United States during this time. Now, during this interregnum period, Cleveland, that was a Freudian slip, as you'll see, was accused of RAPE by a person who he worked with before he became president, who he apparently impregnated. This woman raised Grover Cleveland's child, and during the interim period, decided to come out with the story about how Grover Cleveland had RAPED'd her back years ago. Now, Cleveland vehemently denied it and sued this woman for defamation of character, and he ended up winning this lawsuit. So there's a kind of similarity between Trump and Cleveland in the sense that they were accused of sexual misconduct. They had to go through court cases in order to try and prove that that wasn't true. This kind of thing sticks to their reputations, no matter what the outcomes of the cases are. But at the end of the day, this case did not have a major impact on Cleveland's eventual return to the White House. What did have a huge impact on his return to the White House is what the Republicans did when they were back in power. Cleveland even was a bit of a fan of Harrison. He liked his administration. At first, he thought Harrison was a decent guy. He had no interest in running against him in 4 years, but then Harrison did a few things that changed his mind. Number one is all those pensions that Cleveland had been withholding, Benjamin Harrison started giving those pensions away. To Cleveland, this was unforgivable because it was creating a spending spree that the United States government couldn't handle, in his opinion. The Republicans also passed the McKinley Tariff during Benjamin Harrison's time in office, which raised tariffs to yet unseen heights, and another reason why Grover Cleveland felt he might be needed again. In 1890, Harrison lost the Congress and the Senate, and so this proved that the Harrison administration was vulnerable. The final factor that pushed Grover Cleveland to run for president again was the direction he saw his own party going in. Cleveland was concerned that now that he was gone, the party was going to go all in on silver, on bimetallism, the one thing that Cleveland thought was a terrible idea. He thought it would just ruin the country's money supply, and even though he was in the minority, he felt he was the only one in the party who would stand up for gold. And so he felt he needed to be the party standard bearer to prevent the Democrats from going down the dangerous road of silver. So, relying on his prestige as a former president and some of his old contacts in the political world, he began to give more speeches. He began to create more networks. He built a campaign machine from the outside. And once again, people started to warm to the idea of Grover Cleveland, the underestimated outsider. And he gradually became a favorite for the 1892 race. Cleveland had one major rival for the nomination that year, and it was a senator from New York named David P. Hill. Now, Hill was very popular in the party, and he was kind of looked to as the future. He was more of a silver guy. Well, he made a big mistake when it came time to have the convention. Cleveland had a lot of support from farmers, from people from rural areas, and so to try to prevent these people from showing up to the convention, David P. Hill orchestrated it in such a way that the convention would take place in the middle of winter in Albany. So it'd be very easy for people from the cities where he had the strongest support to get to Albany and vote for him, and it'd be much more difficult for people from the rural areas to make it there, the farmers, the anti-establishment, anti-elite people to get there and support Cleveland. This backfired because everyone saw it for what it was. They were disgusted with Hill, and it caused a massive shift towards Cleveland, who they saw as the more honest, more fair-minded of the two. And Cleveland ended up winning the nomination on the first ballot. And this time, he chose Adlai E. Stevenson as his vice president. And yes, this is Adlai Stevenson's grandfather. His grandson was a two-time failed candidate against Dwight Eisenhower for the presidency and a senator. Adlai E. Stevenson was from Illinois, and Cleveland believed that he could potentially flip Abraham Lincoln's home state, the birth state of the Republican Party in this race, towards the Democrats. The other good thing about Stevenson is that he had a lot of credibility with the growing populist wing, the silver people. And it seemed like if Stevenson was there, a second Cleveland administration might be a little softer on the gold issue. Now, during the Harrison presidency, Harrison did add a lot of new states to the country, which was to his advantage because these would all be potential Republican voters. But these states also happened to be major farm states. And so a lot of the farmers in these states were kind of leaning towards the Democrats. In addition, there was a major third-party run, one of the only elections in which a third party won electoral votes. This was the Populist Party, and they actually ended up destroying that advantage for the Republicans because they won a bunch of farming states out in the western part of the country. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, wow, America must have been so excited to have this former president make this epic comeback back to the White House. And let me tell you, you couldn't be more wrong. Nobody cared about this election. This was one of the most low turnout elections. It was uninspiring, unexciting. There was no assassination attempts. There was nobody working at McDonald's. There was nobody wearing a garbage vest or garbage joke. Nobody cared about this election. It's actually kind of unbelievable. One of the main reasons nobody cared is that both the candidates kept getting sick during the campaign and didn't really have much opportunity to campaign. Cleveland got very sick several times throughout the election, and Mrs. Harrison, the First Lady of the United States, actually caught a cold during the Harrison family vacation, which turned into tuberculosis. She was sick for many months from the entire election, and then she died 2 weeks before the election day. So Benjamin Harrison was in no mood to campaign for the White House. Frankly, he didn't even care if he won or not. There was also a huge union strike during the election in Pennsylvania that really worked against the Benjamin Harrison administration. These factory workers demanded higher wages. The Pinkerton firm showed up and brought scabs to take their place. The workers and townspeople came and attacked the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons killed a bunch of those people, but the workers took over the factory and chased out the Pinkertons, and Harrison was forced to send in 85,000 National Guard to put down the strike. So people were pretty much done with Harrison by that point. And between the tariff and the perception that Cleveland was the anti-elite working man's candidate, he ended up decisively beating Harrison and returning to the White House in that election. Actually, the saddest thing I heard about this election is that President Harrison was in Indiana burying his wife when he received news of his defeat. In response, Harrison was quite relieved. He did not see how he would be able to take on the task before him with the added burden of losing his wife. It's pretty understandable. Cleveland, too, was not overjoyed at the news of his return to the White House, as he knew that the next 4 years were going to be very difficult. He was going to have a lot of fights, and for all he knew, the challenges facing the country were going to be too difficult for him to overcome singularly as the president. And he knew that whatever went wrong, he was going to be blamed for. So he met the news with stoicism and headed to Washington with a pessimistic view of the next 4 years. And boy, was he right. Shortly after Cleveland took office, the Panic of 1893 began. This was an economic crisis caused by the bankruptcy of some of the biggest railroad companies in the country. It caused a steep decline in the economic situation in the United States. Americans felt it. They were unable to get jobs. They were unable to make money. And it all fell on Cleveland's head, who came into the presidency just in time for it. By the end of his term, Cleveland was politically and physically exhausted and did not even consider running for a third term. That honor went to William Jennings Bryan, who represented just about everything that Grover Cleveland was against, especially on the issue of silver. In fact, William Jennings Bryan, who I would kind of call the Bernie Sanders of his era, represented the growing populist movement in the United States to switch to the silver standard and give farmers a better chance at liquidity to get America off what he called the cross of gold. To make matters worse, William Jennings Bryan lost to William McKinley, of all people, the guy who brought the tariff to Washington, D.C. that Grover Cleveland hated so much. Cleveland, though, left Washington, D.C. a relieved man, ready to enjoy his retirement. He ended up moving to Princeton, New Jersey, where one of his neighbors was the exciting young president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson. The two became friends, but soon became enemies because they fell on different sides of a dispute about where to build the Princeton Graduate School. There was this big controversy when Wilson was president of Princeton over where the graduate school should be built. Wilson wanted it built on campus. His rival in the university administration wanted it built separately. We won't get into the details of it, but it was a bitter fight, and Cleveland took the other guy's side. He did not agree with Wilson. When Wilson lost that battle, he was very bitter about continuing as Princeton's president. He ended up leaving the university and opting for a different career, a career in politics. He eventually became president of the United States. In fact, the first Democrat to be elected president since Grover Cleveland. And he pretty much overturned everything that the Grover Cleveland legacy was about. Cleveland was about small government. Cleveland was about staying within our borders. He was kind of an America First president. Wilson was an idealist, internationalist, and a major government grower. But that's a subject for another video. In the end, I found that the Cleveland re-election was about as different from the Trump re-election as I could possibly imagine. Their policies were so different, especially on the tariff. Their campaigns for presidency were fundamentally different. The campaign Trump ran this year was incredibly exciting to watch, and the Cleveland campaign couldn't have been more boring. He kind of just ran the basement campaign and got in somehow. It's a reminder that, once again, these one-to-one comparisons between presidents and their administrations and their history, they just don't always hold up. So I hope that was an interesting little dalliance into the history of the late 19th century in the United States, the history of Grover Cleveland, the history of non-consecutive presidents. Please give my movie a like, a subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you again as history continues to make itself.
Guess who's back? Back again. Cleveland's back. No more Ben.